Hungarian prehistory spans the period of history of the Hungarian people, or Magyars, which started with the separation of the Hungarian language from other Finno-Ugric languages around 800 BC, and ended with the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin around 895 AD. Based on the earliest records of the Magyars in Byzantine, Western European, and Hungarian chronicles, scholars considered them for centuries to have been the descendants of the ancient Scythians and Huns. This historiographical tradition disappeared from mainstream history after the realization of similarities between the Hungarian language and the Uralic languages in the late 18th century. Thereafter, linguistics became the principal source of the study of the Hungarians' ethnogenesis. In addition, chronicles written between the 9th and 15th centuries, the results of archaeological research and folklore analogies provide information on the Magyars' early history. Study of pollen in fossils based on cognate words for certain trees, including larch and elm, in the daughter languages suggests the speakers of the Proto-Uralic language lived in the wider region of the Ural Mountains, which were inhabited by scattered groups of Neolithic hunter-gatherers in the 4th millennium BC. They spread over vast territories, which caused the development of a separate Proto-Finno-Ugric language by the end of the millennium. Linguistic studies and archaeological research evidence that those who spoke this language lived in pit houses and used decorated clay vessels. The expansion of marshlands after around 2600 BC caused new migrations. No scholarly consensus on the Heimat, or original homeland, of the Ugric peoples exists. They lived either in the region of the Tobol River or along the Kama River and the upper courses of the Volga River around 2000 BC. They lived in settled communities, cultivated millet, wheat, and other crops, and bred animals, especially horses, cattle, and pigs. Loan words connected to animal husbandry from Proto-Iranian show that they had close contacts with the neighbors. The southernmost Ugric groups adopted a nomadic way of life by around 1000 BC, because of the northward expansion of the steppes. The development of the Hungarian language started around 800 BC with the withdrawal of the grasslands and the parallel southward migration of the nomadic Ugric groups. The history of the ancient Magyars during the next 1,000 years is uncertain. They lived in the steppes, but the location of their Heimat is subject to scholarly debates. According to one theory, they initially lived east of the Urals and migrated west to Magna Hungaria by 600 AD at the latest. Other scholars say Magna Hungaria was the Magyars' original homeland, from where they moved either to the region of the Don River or towards the Kuban River before the 830s AD. Hundreds of loanwords adopted from Csavar-type Turkic languages prove the Magyars were closely connected to Turkic peoples. Byzantine and Muslim authors regarded them as a Turkic people in the 9th and 10th centuries. An alliance between the Magyars and the Bulgarians in the late 830s was the first historical event that was recorded with certainty in connection with the Magyars. According to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, the Magyars lived in Lovadia in the vicinity of the Khazar Khaganate in the early 9th century and supported the Khazars in the wars for 3 years. The Magyars were organized into tribes, each headed by their own voivodes, or military leaders. After a Pecheneг invasion against Lovadia, a group of Magyars crossed the Caucasus Mountains and settled in the lands south of the mountains. But the majority of the people fled to the steppes north of the Black Sea for the new homeland, which was known as Etelkoz. The Magyars controlled the lands between the lower Danube and the Don River in the 870s. The Confederation of the Seven Tribes was led by two supreme chiefs, the Kend and the Gayula. The Kabars, a group of rebellious subjects of the Khazars, joined the Magyars in Itelkos. The Magyars regularly invaded the neighboring Slavic tribes, forcing them to pay a tribute and seizing prisoners to be sold to the Byzantines. Taking advantage of the wars between Bulgaria, East Francia, and Moravia, they invaded Central Europe at least 4 times between 861 and 894. A new Pecheneг invasion compelled the Magyars to leave Itelkos, cross the Carpathian Mountains, and settle in the Carpathian Basin around 895. Ethnonyms. The Hungarians were mentioned under various ethnic names in Arabic, Byzantine, Slavic, and Western European sources in the 9th and 10th centuries. Arabic scholars referred to them as Magyars, Bashkirs, or Turks. Byzantine authors mentioned them as Huns, Ungrs, Turks, or Savids. Slavic sources used the ethnonyms European, and Western European authors wrote of Hungars, Panons, Avars, Huns, Turks, and Igaran. According to the linguist Gayula Nemeth, the multiple ethnonyms, especially Ungr, Savid, and Turk, reflect that the Magyars had been integrated in various empires of the Eurasian steppes, the tribal confederations of the Onogars and of the Sibirs, and the Turkic Khaganate, before gaining their independence. Ibn Rusta was the first to record a variant of the Hungarian self-designation. According to a scholarly theory, the ethnonym Magyar is a composite word. The first part of the word is said to have been connected to several recorded hypothetical words, including the Mansi's self-designation and a reconstructed Ugric word for man. The second part may have developed from a reconstructed Finno-Ugric word for man, a boy, from a Turkic word with a similar meaning. Alan W. Ertel writes that the ethnonym was initially the name of a smaller group, the Magyar tribe. It developed into an ethnonym because Magyar was the most powerful tribe within the people. Most scholars agree that the Hungarian exonym and its variants were derived from the Onogars name. This form started spreading in Europe with Slavic mediation. Legend of the Wondrous Hind. Most historians agree that the legend of the Wondrous Hind preserved the Hungarians' own myth of their origins. The late 13th century chronicler Simon of Kut-Za was the first to record it. The legend says 2 brothers, Hunna and Magor, were the forefathers of the Huns and Hungarians. They were the sons of Menrot and his wife Enith. While chasing a hind, they reached as far as the marches of the Cvzov, where they abducted the wives of Bela's sons and 2 daughters of Dila, the prince of the Alans. According to historian Gayula Christo, Enith's name derived from the Hungarian word for hind, showing that the Magyars regarded this animal as their totemistic ancestor. Christo also says the 4 personal names mentioned in the legend personify 4 peoples: the Hungarians, the Onogars, the Bulgars, and the Dula, kindred of the Alans of Bulgars. The hunt for a beast, ending with the arrival in a new homeland, was a popular legend among the peoples of the Eurasian steppes, including the Huns and the Mansi. The myth that a people were descended from 2 brothers was also widespread. Consequently, it is possible that Simon of Kut-Za did not record a genuine Hungarian legend, but borrowed it from foreign sources. After the confusion of tongues, the giant entered the land of Havilah, which is now called Persia, and there he begot 2 sons, Hunna and Moga, by his wife Enith. It was from them that the Huns, or Hungarians, took their origins. Hunna and Moga were Menrod's firstborn. They journeyed separately from the father in tents. Now it happened one day when they had gone out hunting in the Meotis marshes that they encountered a hind in the wilderness. As they went in pursuit of it, it fled before them. Then it disappeared from the sight altogether, and they could not find it no matter how long they searched. But as they were wandering through these marshes, they saw that the land was well suited for grazing cattle. They then returned to the father, and after obtaining his permission they took all the possessions and went to live in the Meotis marshes. So they entered the Meotis marshes and remained there for 5 years without leaving. Then in the 6th year they went out, and when by chance they discovered that the wives and children of the sons of Belar were camped in tents in a lonely place without the menfolk, they carried them off with all their belongings as fast as they could into the Meotis marshes. 2 daughters of Dila, prince of the Alans, happened to be among the children who were seized. Hunna took one of them in marriage and Moga the other, and to these women all the Huns owe their origin. Historiography. Medieval theories. According to the annals of St. Bertin, the Magyars who invaded East Francia in 862 were enemies hitherto unknown to the local population. Likewise, Regino of Prum read that the Magyars had been unheard of in the previous centuries because they were not named in the sources. Both remarks evince that late 9th century authors had no knowledge of the Magyars' origins. However, the Magyar raids reminded the Western European and Byzantine scholars of earlier historians' descriptions of the Scythians and Huns, which gave rise to their identification with those peoples. For instance, Leo the Wise listed the Hungarians among the Scythian nations. The similarity between the Latin ethnonyms Hunni and Hungary strengthened the identification of the two peoples, which became commonplace in Western Europe in the 11th century. The Chronicon Ebesbergens was the first source that clearly stated that the Huns and the Hungarians were the same people. The earliest Hungarian chronicles adopted the idea that the Huns and Hungarians were closely related. Anonymous did not mention the Huns, but he referred to Attila the Hun as a ruler from whose line Prince Almos, the supreme head of the Magyar tribes, descended. However, Simon of Acute Zda explicitly identified the Huns and the Hungarians in the 1280. He started his chronicle with a book of the history of the Huns, thus presenting the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin as the reoccupation of a land inherited from their ancestors. Thereafter, the identification of the two peoples was the basic theory of the origins of the Hungarians for centuries. Modern scholarly attempts in the early 18th century to prove a relationship between the Finns and the Huns led to the realization of the similarities between the Finnish and Hungarian languages. Janos Sajnovics's Demonstratio, the first systematic comparative study of Hungarian and the Saami languages, was published in 1770. 3 decades later, Samuel Gyarmathy demonstrated similarities between a larger group of languages that are now known as Uralic languages. However, the majority of Hungarian scholars only gradually adopted Sajnovics's and Gyarmathy's views. In the 1830s, Palhunfalvi still wrote that Hungarian had an intermediate position between the Finnish and Turkic languages, but later accepted that Hungarian is closely related to the Mansi and Khanty languages. Hereafter, linguistics played a preeminent role in the research of the Magyars' prehistory because it was always the dominant linguistic theory that determined the interpretation of historical and archaeological evidence. Consequently, as historian Nora Berend writes, Hungarian prehistory is a tenuous construct based on linguistics, folklore analogies, archaeology, and later written evidence, because there are no certain records of the Magyars before the 9th century, and the identification of archaeological cultures with peoples is highly debatable. Historian Laszlo Kontla identifies the history of Hungarian origins as the history of a community whose genetic composition and cultural character has been changing, but which has assuredly spoken Hungarian or its predecessor language. According to mainstream scholarly consensus, the Hungarians are not the autochthonous population of the Carpathian Basin. Their ancestors arrived there through a series of westward migrations across the Eurasian steppes around 894, centuries after the departure from their original homeland located somewhere in the east. Many details of the Magyars' prehistory, the location of their original homeland, the ancient Magyars' connections with the Turkic peoples and the Khazar Khaganate, the lifestyle and political organization, and a background of the conquest of the Carpathian Basin, are still subject to scholarly debates. With regard of the connections between the Magyars and the Turkic tribes, archaeologist Gyula Laszlo mooted an alternative theory in the 1960s. According to his theory of the double conquest, a large group of people who spoke a Finno-Ugric language arrived in the Carpathian Basin in 670, and a Turkic-speaking people conquered the same territory in the late 9th century. Laszlo's theory has never been widely accepted. Formation of the Magyar people. Before the separation of the Hungarian language, Hungarian has traditionally been classified as an Ugric language within the family of Uralic languages, but alternative views exist. For instance, linguist Harpani Salmanen rejects the existence of a Proto-Ugric language, saying Hungarian was a member of an aerial genetic unit that also included Permic languages. Paleolinguistic research suggests the speakers of the Proto-Uralic language lived in a territory where 4 trees, larch, silver fir, spruce, and elm, grew together. The study of pollen in fossils shows these trees could be found on both sides of the Ural Mountains along the rivers Ob, Pekra, and Kama in the 4th millennium BC. The land between the Urals and the Kama was sparsely inhabited during this period. From around 3600 BC, the Neolithic material culture of the wider region of the Urals spread over vast territories to the west and east. Regional variants emerged, showing the appearance of groups of people who had no close contact with each other. About 1,000 basic words of the Hungarian language, including the names of the seasons and natural phenomena, and the most frequently used verbs, had cognates in other Finno-Ugric languages, suggesting the temporary existence of a Proto-Finno-Ugric language. Between around 2600 and 2100 BC, climatic changes caused the spread of swamps on both sides of the Urals, forcing groups of inhabitants to leave their homelands. The Finno-Ugric linguistic unity disappeared and new languages emerged around 2000 BC. Whether the groups speaking the language from which Hungarian emerged lived to the east or to the west of the Urals in this period is debated by historians. Further climate changes occurring between 1300 and 1000 BC caused the northward expansion of the steppes by about 200 to 300 kilometers, compelling the southernmost Ugric groups to adopt a nomadic lifestyle. Around 800 BC, the climate again changed with the beginning of a wetter period, forcing the nomadic Ugric groups to start a southward migration. Following the grasslands, the movement separated them from the northern Ugric groups, which gave rise to the development of the language from which modern Hungarian emerged. According to historian Laszlo Kontla, the concept of the sky-high tree and some other elements of Hungarian folklore seem to have been inherited from the period of the Finno-Ugric unity. The melodies of the most common Hungarian funeral songs show similarities to tunes of Khanty epic songs. Original Homeland, the Stag and the Eagle, which are popular motifs of 10th century Magyar art, have close analogies in Scythian art. The Scythians, Sarmatians, and other peoples who spoke Iranian languages dominated the Eurasian steppes between around 800 BC and 350 AD. During this period, all ethnic groups in the steppes were nomads with almost identical material cultures, for which the certain identification of the Magyars is impossible. Consequently, the location of their original homeland is subject to scholarly debates. Rona Taz says the development of Hungarian started in the region of the rivers Kama and Volga, west of the Urals. Archaeologist Istvan Fedor writes that the original homeland lay to the east of the Urals. He says that some features of the tumuli erected at Chelyabinsk in the 4th century BC, including the northward orientation of the heads of the deceased and the geometric motifs on the clay vessels put in the graves, are similar to older burials that he attributes to Ugric peoples.